Hey, welcome to Blender Tutor. This is Tom, and today we're going to be creating this looping Mograph animation in Blender 2.9 using cloth dynamics. Let's get started. So let's start off by deleting our default cube and lamp. We're going to bring in a plane. We're going to keep it at the current dimensions, which is 2 by 2 units. Go into edit mode and subdivide by 35. And then with all of those selected, we could extrude up on the Z, just bring it up a little bit, and we could also scale that down just a little bit. Now go into front view, go to wireframe, and select all of the bottom vertices. Now we're going to go into vertex groups, create a new one, assign it. You can rename that to pin. And then one last thing. Go in the top view again, and we're just gonna select the outer vertices on the bottom. We're just gonna add a seam, so when we're UV unwrapping this, we can add a texture to it later, and this will make it a little easier. So with those outer vertices selected, hit Control E, mark seam. All right, before going forward, let's just add a quick material. So for this, I'm actually going to be using the official Blender logo colors. So if you go to blender.org/about/logo, you can grab these. I'm just going to grab that hex code, go into the base color and enter that in and paste it. Now you can see we have that orange. We could actually go into the shading tab. And I'm going to duplicate this node, hit Control T, and that'll bring up these nodes. You need a Node Wrangler add-on enabled for that to work. I'm going to open up the texture I'm going to use is this Blender white background community badge, which is also on the logo page. I already have that downloaded, so I'm just going to go ahead and load that real quick. So we can see it's showing up, but it does not look correct. So I'm going to go up, before I do anything, in object mode, I'm going to hit Control A, adjust scale. And then from the top, I'm going to hit A to select all the vertices and unwrap. I'm going to go ahead and go into the UV editor down here. I'm going to join these and expand this a little bit so we have some more room. So these bottom sets, since we added that seam, it split the top and bottom into 2 separate maps. So this one is our top, it looks like. So this is the bottom of our mesh. We could scale that down, just move it outside of the view of the logo. For this one, we could scale that up. We could see it's showing up, but it is pointing the wrong way. So I'm gonna rotate this to the right. If you hold down Control, it'll snap. I think it's every 5 degrees. The other thing I'm going to do, since I don't want this to be tiling, in the texture node, I'm going to change this from repeat to clip. And now I'm just going to scale this up a little bit more. I want it to be kind of tiny in the center. It's looking good. So now what we're going to do, I'm going to bring in a mix shader. I want the orange on top, I want the logo on the bottom, and then we're going to take the alpha from the texture node, and that'll cut out the logo itself from the orange. And that's pretty much all we need to do for our cloth object. I'm actually going to also add in a plane. I'll just scale it up pretty big. We just want to fully cover up the ground so it doesn't look like our cloth is just floating. I'm going to move this down just a little bit so it's not like overlapping. And then I'm going to go ahead and grab the blue color from the Blender logo, and I will add a material to the ground and just add that blue. All right. Hit 0 on the numpad to go into camera view. We could go into layout view again so we have more room. If you hit N on your keyboard, that'll pop up this tab on the side. Go into View, and then hit turn on camera to view. That way the camera moves while we're rotating around in the scene. I'm going to kind of line this up to the general view I want it to be in. Now we can turn that off. With the camera selected, go to the camera tab. I'm going to change it type from perspective to orthographic. And I'm also going to go down to viewport display, composition guides, turn on center. That's going to give us some lines to help line this up properly. Now in this side tab, I'm going to go to item. We can see our camera rotation. I'm going to change the X to 45 and the Z to -45. And now I'm just going to line this up pretty close to the corners of our cloth object. This doesn't have to be like exact. As long as we do the loop properly, the camera placement won't affect it too much since it's an isometric camera, but I just like visually how this looks. I'm also going to change this to a square render instead of 16 by 9. So I'll do 1200 by 1200. And then back in the camera tab, I'm going to zoom in a little bit, something like that. So the last thing I'm going to do before we start our cloth dynamics is I'm going to add in an HDRI, and I like to use this Studio Small 03 from HDRIHaven.com. I'll have that link in the description. Now if we go into the rendered view, we can see it's loaded up, but it is kind of blowing it out because of the reflections. So what I'm going to do is, in our render tab, I'm going to go down to color management. For exposure, I'm going to do -1.6, and then for look, I'm going to change it from none to high contrast, and that is the settings I used for my final render. Just two more quick things. Let's turn on ambient occlusion. I'm going to put that up to 1.2. I'm also going to turn on screen space reflections, and I'll actually just turn on high bit depth for shadows. So now we can actually get into the cloth dynamics. So with our plane selected, add cloth sim, bring up the quality steps to 10, vertex mass down to 0.2. For stiffness, I'm going to change tension and compression down to 5, shear to 3. For shape, use that pin group. We'll use the pin vertex group we created. We're also going to use the shrinking factor, which I'm going to go over in a second, but let's actually change collisions to 5, and we'll turn on self collisions. You can collapse that now. And yeah, so let's turn on pressure first. That's kind of going to be the main setting that will inflate our cloth right now. So I'm going to bring that up to 5. Now, if you press spacebar, press play, you can see it's inflating, but it is like barely inflating. What we're going to do to change that is we're going to go to the shape shrinking factor. I'm going to bring that down to -0.25. And now if we do that again, you can see it inflates a lot more. It's kind of blocky, so let's turn on shade smooth, and let's also add a subsurf modifier. Hit Control 2 to quickly add one. And that's already looking pretty good. So basically the shrinking factor lets the cloth stretch the mesh a little more. If I brought that down to -1, it'll go even more intense, which is kind of cool looking, but that's much more than we're going to need for this animation. You could obviously adjust this to whatever you want it to look like, but for me I thought -0.25 looked pretty good. And that way it doesn't blow out too much sideways, so it won't like overlap inflating cushions next to it. So yeah, that's looking pretty good. And we got our camera set up now. So the next thing we're going to do, we will do the animation for the camera. And then the last thing we're going to do is duplicate this cloth object to create our looping animation. So let's select our camera, and I said to keep the original plane at its initial settings of 2 by 2 units. The reason for that is we need to make sure we are moving an exact amount every frame so that we can loop this properly. In my animation, I'm using 24 frames a second. So for my full animation, I'm going to make it 48 frames. So we could go to our end frame down here in the timeline, change that to 48, keep this start on 1. And with the camera selected, I'm going to move over on the X, -2. If you hold Control, it'll move 1 unit at a time. So moving that over 2. I will add a keyframe by hitting I in location. And I'll go to the last frame, and we're going to actually go 1 beyond the last frame. So let's go to 49 and go over 4 on the X forward. So hold down Control. You can see right here, it's 4 meters. I'm going to hit I location. And you can see there's no keyframe showing up down here. I don't know why it's doing this, but the timeline's actually a little taller than it will show in the window. So using the middle mouse button, you can scroll up and down and you can see your keyframes. The reason I went to 49 instead of 48 is if it ended on 48, which we're still going to be rendering out, that's basically going to be overlapping with frame 1 in terms of placement on the grid. So you would have like 1 frame of stutter if you started and ended in the same location on the grid. So by moving it to 49, which we're not going to render, that will basically lead smoothly back into frame 1. So then when we bring this into another program to create the animation, it will loop properly with no stutter. Okay, so now that we have animated the camera, we're going to work with our cloth object. So you could select the cloth object, move it over -6 on the X. So GX -6, and we just basically we want to start with the first one all the way to the left, because since we're going to be moving in our animation to the right, since it's going to be a progression of the bubbles inflating, I want this to be done first, and it'll gradually be moving to the right. So it just makes sense to start on the left and go forward to the right. So from here, I'm also going to move it down on the Y by 2. I know we won't be seeing this one, and in the long run, we could actually delete this if you don't want to wait for it to cache in the cloth physics tab, but we're just going to need 3 on this left side to duplicate across the plane, just so we have a grid. So I'm going to, before we duplicate this anymore, let's set some keyframes. We're going to keyframe the pressure. So I want the inflation to take 24 frames. You could get out of camera view for now. So on frame 24, I'm going to go to this pressure, add a keyframe, go back to frame 1 in the timeline, and I'm going to change this to 0.1. And now if we go to cache, bring this down to 24. And I'll just bake that real quick, just to see how it looks. Cool. Get a little bounce there, and then it just freezes, which we want because we need it to stop moving so that we could loop this easier. All right, so I'm gonna delete those bakes for now just so I can move this around. So I'm gonna go back into camera view. I'll Shift D, move it up on the Y, hold Control to snap it on the grid. Move that up 2 meters. I'm going to do that one more time on the Y. So then I will select all of these. Okay, so with these 3 duplicated now, we're actually going to have them all selected. And with our keyframes down here, we're going to move these before the beginning of our timeline, actually, because we want these to be inflated. If you look at our actual looping animation, the ones on the left are already inflated at the beginning. So with all 3 of these selected, look down on our timeline. We have to actually move down here with our cursor. We can hit GX -48. The reason I'm doing that is I basically want the animation to have started and happened, full inflation of these, before we even start the loop or start the animation. So these should just be basically fully inflated before we even start playing. So we will need to change some settings in our cache. Obviously, it'll need to start on -48, and it can end on -24. We're gonna need to do that for all three of these. So let's bake all dynamics. So since I changed these keyframes to happen before our timeline starts, you can see they're just, even on the first frame, they are fully inflated and they will not be moving or animating during our animation, which is what we want. So that was more of a test why I baked those. So I'm gonna actually delete those bakes. And now I'm going to duplicate those and move it over 2 meters. And with those three selected, I'll go down to the timeline again and GX24 to move those forward a full second. And that we could actually, if we want to not take so much time baking, we could change this to -24 and it'll still end on the first frame. I'm just gonna bake those and make sure that all looks correct. So I'll be right back. All right, so that is baked and those are also looking correct. So let's just do that again. Select these three. Let's delete the bakes first. For some reason, it sometimes acts a little weird if you try to duplicate a baked object. So those three selected, Shift D, X2, move those over. And now with those three selected, down in the timeline, GX24 for 24 frames. So now we're going to want to change the simulation start to 0, end on 24. I'm gonna do that for all three of them. Okay, so those are all the same start and end. Bake those, and then I'll be back when that bake is done. All right, so that is finished baking, so we could scrub through that and see that is inflating. So we will now repeat that process. Let's delete all bakes, grab those three, Shift D, X2. With those three selected, go down the timeline, GX24, oops, undo that. Make sure both keyframes are selected, so GX24. So now with these, we're gonna want them to start on frame 0 and end on 48. So make sure all three of those are the same, so 0, 48, 0, 48, 0, 48. And we're gonna bake that again and check it out. This takes a long time, it is annoying, but you want to make sure you're doing it right at each step, or else you will do what I did and kind of do it all at once, bake it, and then see something's not right and you're not sure where it happened, and you kind of just got to start from scratch and start all over. So it's a little easier to just do one step at a time and rebake it each time to see how it's going. All right, so those are baked. So let's So we are running into some issues here because since this is our first frame that we're going to be rendering, it might actually be okay. So let's just keep that for now. You can see we're actually rendering, since if we start on frame 1, you could see that everything's very smooth, and then as soon as we get a couple frames in, they kind of wrinkle a bit while they're adjusting to the cloth simulation. Even though they haven't started inflating yet, they're kind of like normalizing where they're going to be sitting until they start inflating. So clearly that won't line up properly with our first frame when the animation loops. What we can do though is, since this really only takes 24 frames to loop, we could use the first 24 frames in our timeline to like let the cloth sim normalize before we start using the frames. So what we'll actually do is we're only going to render from frame 25 to 48, which will be 24 frames, which means the camera will be here. So we don't actually need these first rows. So we could delete those and we'll keep these. So now we can duplicate these. So Shift D X2 is what we want. And what we'll do is we will move these keyframes forward 24 frames. So with these three selected, GX24, so move those up. So now we can still start the simulation on frame 0. And actually what we should do is with these three selected, let's move it back to let's move it back 2 frames. So even 1 frame. Let's just move it back 1 frame in the timeline so it ends on frame 48. Let's bake all of that real quick. So delete bakes, bake all dynamics. All right, so those are baked. So let's watch that animation. So that's gonna puff up. All right, so far so good, I think. So let's grab these 3 now. Let's delete the bakes. Kind of just reset the cloth sim so it'll rebake properly. So let's, with those 3, Shift D X, move it over 2. We just need enough to cover our view. So we'll need, we just need to move this one over one more. So Shift D X2. So let's bake all dynamics one more time, and hopefully we should be good after this. Okay, so that is baked again. Everything seems to be looking okay. We could watch this in very slow 2 frames a second. I think it's looking okay. So what we're gonna do now is let's just render out the viewport mode before we fully render out in fully shaded mode, just to see how the animation's looking before we wait for it to render. Even though this is EV, it doesn't take that long. It's always nice to render out like quicker. So I'm gonna change this to a JPEG sequence, and I'm just gonna create a folder to save this to. Okay, so the way we're gonna do this, let's turn off show overlays, go to view and viewport render animation. And that will just render out each frame from the viewport really quickly, since it doesn't take any time to render anything. It's just the viewport mode. We can bring that into After Effects now. So I'm going to go ahead and import that new sequence, create a new comp from selection, and we'll just go ahead and play that real quick. So I actually think the loop is looking okay. I do see a little stutter when it starts over again. So it might be the placement of the camera. Let's try one more thing. So select the camera, and I'm gonna go ahead and bring this over to the 48th frame. So with that done, I'm gonna render this out one more time. All right, so I have done that. I feel like I'm still seeing maybe a little stutter. It's not super noticeable, but I'm maybe still seeing a little stutter, but I do think this loop is looking better than that first attempt. And you can kind of see a little popping from the loop when it goes from the last frame to the first frame, but I do think this is working pretty good. So I'm gonna go ahead and render this fully now. And before I set render, I am going to turn on motion blur. I'll keep it at the default 0.5 for the shutter speed. Probably bring the steps up to 3 or 4. That's just like the quality. It does add a little bit of render time, but it just smooths out the motion blur a little bit. So I'm just gonna like pick a random frame and I'll just render that. So that is the rendered frame with the motion blur. I do find that it adds a little smoothness to the animation. That might help with that little jitter I was seeing. So I am going to render that out now, and we'll be back to look at the final result. All right, so I have rendered this out a few times. I did run into some issues, so I did tweak the materials a little bit, and I've gotten a pretty decent loop going. It's moving a little faster than I would prefer. I think my initial one, it was a little more zoomed out, which I think helped it not seem like it was moving so fast. So I would say while you're working on this, maybe think about not having it pushed in so far. I thought maybe it would make it easier to not have to duplicate the cushions so many times. But now that I see it in motion, it is kind of fast. So yeah, I would have the camera zoomed out a little more. And even with the adjustments I've made, I know this isn't a perfect loop. And I do think it kind of depends on the texture and material you're using. Obviously, the biggest reason for it not looping properly is the cloth simulation itself. If the shape is even a little bit different, you're going to notice a loop there. But I do think I've found a middle ground with this where it is close enough that it's not super noticeable. I think the biggest problem with this one is it's just pushed in too close. So it just feels like it's moving too fast. You can't even really read the Blender logo with the motion blur on this. But I think it's not super noticeable. I'm going to show you the last one. This is the one I did with the default material, and it's a lot shinier. And because the cloth moves a little bit between the grid like movement, you could see it pop into place once it starts over every time. You could basically, like right here, you could see the cloth move. And I didn't actually change the cloth simulation in this one. And if you're looking for it, you do see it move. But because I turned the specularity down on this, it's not quite as noticeable. And if you're looking more at like the Blender logo, and if you're looking at the cushions inflating, it's not going to be as noticeable. It kind of just looks like a looping animation, which is what we're going for. So also the amount I keyframed. So in my initial loop that I showed you at the beginning, I actually did a 5-second export. So it doesn't loop every 24 frames, it loops every 120 frames. And because of that, I think I get away with it a little easier because it's not quite as noticeable that it is looping, or that there's like a seam in between the start and the end of it. The other thing I did obviously with this one is the material is a lot different. So I think maybe that helped a little bit. I didn't realize at the time when I was making this, but this material actually made it loop a little easier, I think, because there isn't a lot of harsh specularity on it. But yeah, I mean, I think this taught you the basics of it. Definitely, even without not including this specific animation, I think looping with dynamics, like any dynamics, is a lot harder than looping just a hand animated animation, because you can make sure to start and end in the same placement when you're hand animating. Anytime you're working with dynamics, it's going to be a lot tougher, at least with Blender. I think if you're like in Houdini or some kind of really specialized software that's made for that, it probably has a lot more control where you can make sure it's going to start and end in the place you need it to. With this, especially since we're doing it so quickly, it's not going to be perfect, but I think you could get it close enough that it's going to be passable. Especially for something like this where I just created it for like my Instagram. But I think you learned some, basics here, especially with timing your animation to get it to loop properly. And I think that's what I really wanted to go over. I do apologize that this isn't a perfect loop, but this is actually like the third or fourth time I've recorded this, and this is the closest one I've gotten since my initial Instagram post that I made. And And I've been tweaking a lot of values and everything and practicing, but this does just take a lot of trial and error to get this right. So, you know, I would say try it out, have some fun with it. If you don't need it to loop, that's even better. If you just want to make an animation where you have these like cool inflating things and it doesn't need to loop, you know, that's going to probably be a lot easier for you, but this will get you pretty close to a looping animation if you do it this way. So I do apologize that this wasn't perfect, but let me know in the comments what you thought about this tutorial. If there's anything else like this you would like to see me make a tutorial on, or if there's any other types of Mograph tutorials you want to see. I've already had a few people reach out with some ideas, so I do have some things I want to try in the future, but I always love hearing from you guys and seeing what else you think. Speaking of Mograph animations, I did make this other one about a week ago. This one is not looping, but this is just a really cool waving orbs tutorial that I made, and that one was a lot of fun and people seem to like it, so I think I'm gonna keep making some more Mograph tutorials. But yeah, let me know anything else you guys would like to see. Otherwise, thanks for watching. Make sure to subscribe if you are interested in learning more about Blender, and otherwise I will see you all next time. Bye.